Let me begin by thanking Lorenzo for inviting me to come to Harvard this afternoon to share some ideas with you regarding African politics, particularly the issue of democracy, but with particular reference to Kenya and what we have recently gone through in terms of an election, which on at its face value is supposed to have been a democratic election, but in terms of following the rules of the game of a democratic election, left us with some questions to be asked and to be answered. And I'm quite sure that if you're students of international affairs or politics or just general readers of what's going on in the world today, you must have realized that over the last couple of months, Kenya has featured a lot in international papers and in discussions about what's going on in Africa. So my talk today is going to be on legitimizing authoritarian rule through quote-unquote democratic elections in Africa. It's a subject that I've been interested in a long time, how authoritarian regimes use elections not so much to advance democracy, but to seek to legitimize themselves in power, mainly because they realize that the international environment does not tolerate governments which are imposed on the people. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, you become much more credible to donors, as it were, if you hold regular elections and appear as if you are democratic. And this phenomenon has been going on in Africa. And Kenya, which was expected really, from what people know of African politics today, to be doing better, is perhaps not doing that well. So recent political events following the disputed presidential elections in Kenya has brought African politics, not just Kenyan politics, into global attention, signified by multiple editorials in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and many other papers. This attention has made those who assume democracy is no longer on the agenda of African social movements for political and progressive social change to reflect more thoughtfully about Africa and about the fate of democracy in Africa. Hillary Clinton, for example, having lost the US presidency last year to Donald Trump under controversial circumstances, with accusation of cybercrime having been employed to facilitate Trump's win, has appealed to fellow Americans to reflect on the Kenyan experience as a comparative example of what tragically befell her, and how perhaps her case could have been better sorted out and actually more fairly attended to, where the US will have a constitution and courts such as those to be found in Kenya. That perhaps is quite a profound statement, that in terms of the rule of law and the ability of courts to nullify presidential elections, Kenya set an example to the world, because here, since I remember twice, it has been rather difficult for the Supreme Court to pronounce itself on that, always confirming the elected president as duly elected, notwithstanding evidence that could exist to the contrary. You remember the case of Al Gore against Bush, and of course the controversial case of Trump, who was elected by an electoral college, but not by popular vote. So those are interesting cases that made Hillary Clinton wonder aloud whether indeed what happened in Kenya is not a lesson to the Americans in terms of settling a disputed presidential election. But perhaps it's not just about courts and constitutions. While these are vital in a democratic society or in the evolution of such a society, they are not enough in a successful process of democratization. Some other things need, however, to be taken into account, which include, among other things, the history of democratic struggles in a country, the context in which certain political events occur, the nature of the state and the political culture which can nurture elections as an essential aspect of democracy, the individuals and movements involved in the struggle for democracy or against it, and peculiar elements related to the processes and institutions within which the elections are held and managed. The decision in Kenya by Chief Justice David Maraga, Supreme Court, to nullify the election of Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta, following the recent appeal lodged by the National Super Alliance, NASA, and its presidential candidate Raila Amolo Odinga, obviously came as a shock to Kenyans and indeed to Africa as a whole. For the first time, an African court had nullified the election of a sitting African president. Part of the shock came as a result of the conservative assumption that, however meritorious such a case could be, many people in and outside Kenya believe that no judge in Kenya would dare nullify the election of the incumbent president, especially when Justice Willie Mutunga's Supreme Court could not do so in the year 2013 in a case filed by the same Odinga, which was regarded as even more meritorious before a Chief Justice who was, in return, regarded, given his background, as exceptionally principled and with a penchant for defending democracy and social justice. Justice Willie Mutunga was held very highly in the eyes of Kenyans. Was a Chief Justice that could easily nullify such an election, but he failed to do so. That Justice Maraga and 3 other judges confirmed the nullification of the election, while their 2 colleagues declined to do so, immediately led to a high voltage political outburst by President Uhuru Kenyatta and his supporters. And the political drama aside, we need to analyze the implication of the decision regarding our understanding of the role of elections in advancing democratic governance in Kenya in particular and in Africa in general. In that regard, we shall need to know who the real promoters of democracy are in contexts where there seems to be, what seems to, as a normal court decision, given the provisions of the Kenyan Constitution, is assumed to be undermining state authority by the incumbent president, whose election was nullified following an election that the judges deemed not to have been in accordance neither with the written law nor with the Constitution. In other words, where the rules of the game were not followed, such an election was regarded by the judges as having been a nullity, and therefore they nullified it. We shall seek to argue that elections are held by presidential authoritarian regimes in most African countries, not for the incumbent president to risk losing his or her incumbency, but for the very event of holding an election to provide such a regime with legitimacy. You saw what happened in Gambia some time ago, when the incumbent president refused to leave power, because for him, even though he had lost the election, he didn't feel that was reason enough for him to leave power. For him, the election was being held purely to legitimize himself in power, whether the people voted for him overwhelmingly or not. This legitimacy is not simply confined to holding periodic elections. It also extends to other approval-seeking forms of behavior, such as frequent delegations pledging loyalty to the president, extensive parades with multiple state honors frequently given for political loyalty, and so on. I have observed very frequently in Africa that presidents don't just hold election to seek legitimacy. They also have a tendency for very frequent holding of events that make them seek approval from the people. And that is a form of saying that they are popular with the people, even if the people are doing it under duress. The very nature of authoritarian rule, particularly the varieties of presidential authoritarian regimes that later the African continent today, usually make us assume that such decisions as the one made by Justice Maraga in Kenya, in the Kenyan court, are impossibilities. And even if and when they happen, they must be regarded as aberrations occasioned by inappropriate laws and legislation meant to undermine political stability and legitimate interests of the people. In the final analysis, the regime sees them as accidents and nasty interludes, which must be overcome in the long drama of the unending authoritarian tragedy. This, I believe, is the case with the Uhuru Ruto regime in Kenya, which we need to dispassionately analyze and understand as we await the solution of the problem as it unfolds. Let me first begin by placing the Kenyan context in the African context. I have for a long time been interested in the phenomenon of political authoritarianism in Africa. I particularly paid much attention to presidential authoritarian rule. Hence my article in African Affairs in 1989 and various other pieces published in books, journals, and newspapers discussing democratic struggles faced with authoritarian rule. My argument has been that at the dawn of independence, popular struggles for political independence and/or national liberation put into political power groups of people, be they elected political parties or conquering liberation movements, through largely democratic processes. Subsequently, however, such movement parties or conglomerates of individuals degenerated. Oh, would I kindly speak up? I thought I had a microphone.
No, it's just recording on the way.
Oh, it's just recording. Oh, is there one here? Does this one help?
No, that's recording too. Just if you could speak up, please.
Okay, I'll try my best. My argument has been that at the dawn of independence, popular struggles for political independence and/or national liberation put into political power groups of people, be they elected political parties or conquering liberation movements, through largely democratic processes. Subsequently, however, such movements, parties, or conglomerates of individuals degenerated into tightly knit elites enjoying exclusive political power and using such power to enrich themselves and to systematically impoverish the popular masses. This phenomenon first emerged as the democratic African one-party state, democratic in quotes, rationalized as necessary to enhance national unity, speed up development, and promote Pan-Africanism. Mwalimu Julius Nyerere was its best proponent, arguing that Africans could not afford the excesses of the Westminster type of football democracy, where at least two competitive political players had to be in the field for the game to be valid. The one-party state could be both democratic and developmental, especially when its leaders were committed to socialism and public policy in all areas of development were guided by socialist principles. That was the argument of people like Nyerere. In the 60s and early 70s, Nyerere's arguments won applause from progressive Africans and social democrats, particularly from Africa and the Scandinavian countries, particularly those who believed that socialism was possible in Africa under one-party dictatorial regimes. The excesses of the one-party state and the emergence of authoritarian rule were nonetheless beginning to be felt, especially among the regimes where the socialist rhetoric had drastically declined and capitalist accumulation had openly been proclaimed as a viable path for development by the mid-60s. Kenya and Cote d'Ivoire stood out as notable examples of such avowedly capitalist models of development under authoritarian one-party rule, and they were deemed as it were successful. My concern for doing research for my PhD thesis at the University of Chicago in the mid-70s on the political economy of coffee production in Kenya and Cote d'Ivoire was to analyze how the economic interests of the ruling classes in the two countries explain the authoritarian character of the state and the emergence of the presidential authoritarian regimes. Such regimes ruthlessly put down demands for justice and equitable development by trade unions, intellectuals, and popular movements. Detentions without trial of state critics became widespread. As such, political dissent and criticism was always seen as treasonable and requiring maximum punishment. For quite some time, even progressive forces in the Western world regarded this suppression of social justice and democracy as somehow necessary for the sake of development. And Africa could only develop provided this repression continued. In this regard, Western imperialism comfortably cohabited with the most repressive and authoritarian regimes in Africa, including despicable military dictatorships as in Zaire, Uganda, the Central African Republic, and so on. Such regimes, as long as they were regarded as politically stable, became permanent allies of the Western world as defense lines against the communist bloc in the East. They were lavished with aid and military support from the West, showered with praises on global forums, and given intelligence information about their nationals who were critical of them and who agitated for change. Faced with global terrorism, the search for stable governments in Africa, notwithstanding their non-democratic character, may lead these securocrats in Western capitals to ignore or downplay problems of election rigging in Africa. But we shall return to this issue presently. Notwithstanding the very strong support authoritarian regimes in Africa received from external sources, they were still challenged from within the state and from outside the state. Within the state, they were challenged by the military for diverse reasons, as both Ruth First and Samuel De Carlo pointed out in their two very brilliant books on military rule in Africa. And these reasons always revolve on conflicts over access to state resources, privileges, and wealth. And since civilian ruling elites had developed the habit of relying on command politics within the state to maintain their privileges, who was more qualified to command, asked Ruth First, than the military? From without, the regimes were challenged by diverse popular social forces and movements emerging from within the crevices of society from time to time, quite often scoring notable successes for brief periods of time, but nonetheless sustaining the tradition that the popular struggles for democracy was always on the agenda. Well before the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, African scholars were studying and reporting on these popular struggles, since a good number of these scholars had been part and parcel of the movements for liberation in Africa, or for democratic freedom. A research project by a group of scholars initiated by the Third World Forum based in Dakar in 1985, which I coordinated, finally published a book in 1987, which I edited under the title Popular Struggles for Democracy in Africa. In this book were studies of popular movements across the continent, which had, over the long period of time, organized democratic struggles and put pressure on authoritarian regimes at great risks. One of their biggest stumbling blocks was the international support these regimes received from both the East and the West, and the legitimacy they had in international fora. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, this support and source of legitimacy fell down as a house of cards, and finally these regimes had to confront their domestic challenge from democratic popular movements, quite often without being very well prepared on how to adjust. Thus, in West Africa, panicky regimes suddenly succumbed to demands for national conferences with popular forces to settle the democratic demands. The outcomes were varied. In East Africa, where periodic semi-competitive elections had been held since independence within the one-party state, the regimes gave in to demands for multi-party politics and quickly organized elections without any substantial change in the electoral rules and the way they were managed. In almost all cases in West, East, and Southern Africa, there was hardly any change in regime type. New individuals ascended to the helm of the state, very often with the same ruling party. Where a new party emerged, it was quite often closely intertwined with the mother party, and the authoritarian regime simply continued under the form of a multi-party political system. But under intense pressure to hold regular and periodic elections as an aspect of democratic governance, these regimes adopted quickly holding regular elections and ensuring they won them. Thus in Kenya, multi-party elections were held in 1992 and 1997, which Moi won, notwithstanding the glaring cases of rigging that showed the Democratic Party, for example, actually won the 1997 election. The High Court delayed to hear the petition that Mwai Kibaki put to it, and finally dismissed the case on mere technicality. This happens in most countries in Africa, and not just in Kenya. In Uganda, for example, when it was very clear in the High Court that Museveni had been defeated in the election in 1996, the Supreme Court Chief Justice called Museveni that he had been defeated, and Museveni ordered the Supreme Court Chief Justice to declare him the winner. Otherwise, the judge himself would be detained without trial. In the 2002 general elections, Moi was constitutionally barred from standing due to the 10-year term limit that had been enacted earlier in 1997 as part of the constitutional reforms that Moi succumbed to following tremendous pressure by the opposition. During the run-up to the 1997 elections, realizing the limited democratic space that the Constitution then provided, the opposition political parties in Kenya mounted a county-wide campaign for constitutional reforms ahead of the elections under the slogan, "No reforms, no elections." The Moi regime was forced to call a truce by establishing an inter-party parliamentary group to come up with a package of amendments to the Constitution and election laws that was so as to allow the elections to be held. The opposition, for example, got the opportunity for the first time to name half of the members of the expanded Electoral Commission, a step that made the supervision of the elections a little bit much fairer than before. Notwithstanding all these changes, Moi still won the 1997 election with the minority votes, taking advantage of the multiplicity of candidates and the loopholes in staffing ballot boxes. In other words, Moi won not through a free and fair election, but largely by staffing ballot boxes because of the weaknesses that were in their electoral process. Can I get some water, please? The 2002 elections were different. The opposition learned that multiplicity of presidential candidates gave the ruling party KANU, the Kenya National African Union, an advantage to win even with a minority of votes. 3 years of intense negotiations for a united front of the opposition ahead of the election and a split in KANU over the choice of the presidential candidate since Moi was not running provided an opportunity for a broad alliance to emerge between the renegade KANU leaders and the then united opposition based on a pre-election memorandum of understanding for forming a government. The broad alliance, born hardly 2 months before the elections of December 2002, was called the National Rainbow Alliance. With the formation of the National Rainbow Coalition, whose leaders came from all ethnic communities except the Kikuyu and the Kalenjin communities, led by both Moi and Uhuru Kenyatta, respectively, KANU's presidential candidate, Uhuru Kenyatta, found himself disadvantaged to mobilize the Kikuyu community to vote for him, since Mwai Kibaki, himself a Kikuyu, the NAC presidential candidate, had an added advantage of extensive personal and business relationship with the Kikuyu elite, having been a minister in several portfolios in both the Kenyatta and Moi regimes, and having been Moi's vice president for several years, following Kenyatta's demise in 1978. NAC won the 2002 elections with an overwhelming majority, thereby forming a government that had a broad national base and unquestionable legitimacy. For the first time since the independence elections in 1963, Kenyans felt they had been given the freest opportunity to elect a government of their choice. Not surprisingly, Kenyans were rated the happiest people on the face of the earth for the few months following the elections. Having been formed essentially for the purpose of winning the election, NAC faced major problems of balancing the interests of its members and coalition leaders once it was in power. Disagreements soon emerged over the implementation of the pre-election memorandum of understanding in sharing positions in government, with the Rainbow Alliance, the group that split from KANU, feeling shortchanged. The Kikuyu elite around Kibaki, taking advantage of the president's ill health, began to practice the politics of exclusion and rent-seeking that further alienated leading members of the coalition from other parties. The implementation of the coalition pre-election commitment to undertake constitutional reforms within 100 days after the elections also created a major disagreement. The Kibaki faction and its conservative business elite disagreed with the proposal for devolution, the parliamentary system of government, and putting a limit on the age, putting a limit on the size of land ownership. They rejected the draft agreed constitution at the Bomas of Kenya Delegates Conference and crafted one of their own under the guidance of the Attorney General Amos Wako and carefully chosen pro-Kibaki cabinet ministers governed in the coastal city of Kilifi, and decided to present this other draft constitution for a memorandum held in October 2005. The NAC cabinet split into two over the referendum issue. One group supporting the earlier, more progressive Bomas draft, and hence opposing the Kilifi draft presented at the referendum, was led by Raila Amolo Odinga, while Kibaki led the group that supported the Kilifi draft, also known as the Wako draft. The Kilifi draft was overwhelmingly rejected at the referendum, giving Raila Odinga and his team a proven popular base to bail on in a subsequent election. The 11 ministers and assistant ministers who opposed the Kibaki government position on the referendum were immediately removed from the cabinet after Kibaki dissolved his government and appointed a new one without them. Pushed to the opposition, this group proceeded to form a new party, the Orange Democratic Movement, ODM, capitalizing on the orange symbol that the Kenya Electoral Commission assigned to them in the referendum. In the 2007 elections, the ODM faced Kibaki's newly minted Party of National Unity as it fielded Raila Amolo Odinga as its presidential candidate against Kibaki. There is no doubt that Odinga won the 2007 election, but the results were badly manipulated and inflated to make it difficult for the Electoral Commission to ascertain the validity of that election. It is this election, its disputed results, the post-election violence that followed in its wake, and the rapprochement brokered by Kofi Annan between the two warring parties to form a coalition government that has virtually defined the essence of authoritarian regime that resists, domesticates, manipulates, conforms to, and adjusts to so-called democratic elections while remaining essentially authoritarian. During several weeks of discussions in January and February 2008, by representatives of both parties under the chair of Kofi Annan, it was agreed that the crisis was not simply about who won the elections. Their crisis was wider than that. It involved how the Kenyan political economy had evolved since independence, what kinds of grievances citizens had against each other and their government, their fellow citizens, and the environment in which they lived, how the government had over time dealt with such issues as land ownership and access to public opportunities. To what extent did people live with respect to their culture, their sense of human worth, and how through time these had been abused and become bottled up so as to burst out asunder during a political crisis surrounding an election dispute? To what extent did politicians exploit such grievances for their advantage, causing conflict and loss of life among communities? How would such politicians be identified to face the law as to avoid such incidences in the future? What institutions and processes were necessary to make the people elect governments that people could control, while such governments also ruled legitimately and effectively? In the end, it was agreed that the Constitution of Kenya, amended at least 27 times since independence, was part of the problem. It had been crafted and recrafted over time to stifle democracy, good governance, social justice, the rule of law, and socioeconomic progress, such that it needed to be urgently reviewed and a new one written that would address the issues raised above and provide the context for the democracy Kenyans had yearned for. An entrenched ruling elite benefiting from presidential authoritarianism had stifled this review in the past. A commission led by Justice Johan Kriegler from South Africa was proposed with strict guidelines to look at what went wrong in the elections and to propose constitutional and legal changes that would guarantee free and fair elections in future. In a sense, the report of the Justice Johan Kriegler Commission identified election mistakes committed by political parties as well as the Electoral Commission. It detailed major institutional weaknesses and lack of appropriate processes in managing elections in Kenya. The new constitution that Kenyans finally approved at a referendum in October 2010 and the electoral institutions and processes that were eventually established in its wake took into full account the Kriegler recommendations and need to be contextualized in terms of the politics that heralded the crisis of 2007-2008, in which 1,500 people died and 5,000 people lost their homes and property. It is to be noted that the 2017 presidential election is the second in a row to be held without the full implementation of the reforms recommended by the Justice Kriegler report. Of importance was the report's emphasis on the secure simultaneous transmission to the National Tallying Center and integration of the results handling systems within a progressive election results announcement system. It is to be noted that this is where the Chebukati Commission erred most, hence the petitioner's centerpiece in pleading before the court that the 2017 presidential election be nullified. Regarding murders, massacres, and gross abuses of human rights, either by state agencies and political actors in the 2007-2008 election, a commission led by Justice Philip Waki was set up to identify the major culprits and recommended action to be taken. The report by the commission identified those in both the government and the opposition who are most responsible for instigating the post-election violence, and gave the Kenyan government a term period within which a tribunal would be formed to try such people. Failing to do that would mean reporting these people to the International Criminal Court, ICC, for action. It is interesting to note that while there was a general pressure to take the cases to the ICC before the names were known, opposition to the ICC process emerged as soon as the names were known, including those of Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto, who currently are the president and the vice president. The 2013 elections were fought by the two in a coalition that propelled them to power, with a case at the IEBC as a major reason to be president and deputy president. As long as they were president and deputy president, they felt that they would be shielded from trial at the ICC, and hence their campaign at the African Union for African states to disengage from the Hague process, and hence their determination to win the elections in Kenya in 2013 and 2017, notwithstanding the irregularities. It is because the two have taken it upon themselves that they need state power to defend themselves from the Hague process, and therefore they will do all they can to subvert the democratic process to win, as it were, the elections unfairly. Further, the National Accord signed between the two parties setting up the coalition government and entrenched in the constitution then gave a strict agenda to the government to undertake reforms and pass appropriate legislations that would implement the new constitution. Except by providing for a presidential system of government rather than a parliamentary system of government in a devolved system of government, the October 20 constitution in Kenya has been hailed as perhaps one of the most progressive constitutions in Africa, given its Bill of Rights and the provisions it made for democratic elections. Provisions which currently seem to have been completely undermined by the Electoral Commission, hence the case that NASA and their presidential candidate, Raila Amolo Odinga, took to court And the justices decided to uphold their case and declare that election null and void, forcing Kenyans to face another election on the 26th of October this year, but with Uhuru and Ruto out openly to oppose that election and to undermine both the Supreme Court and the IEBC in making any changes with regard to the ruling of the Supreme Court that expected the IEBC to take certain reforms and make sure that the travesties that they saw in the election with regard to not following the Constitution and the election laws in declaring any president fully elected. The Supreme Court ruled, after examining the evidence brought before them by NASA, that the elections held on the 8th of August 2017 were not held in accordance with the Constitution, as indeed the Constitution passed 2010 after much crisis in Kenya, and were not held in accordance with the election laws, and therefore they had to be nullified, and the IEBC was ordered to organize new elections and to hold them in accordance with the Constitution and the established law. Otherwise, the Supreme Court would again nullify those elections. That decision by the Supreme Court has been opposed by both Uhuru and Ruto, who in the meantime have initiated another process in the Kenyan parliament to change the laws governing elections, to cut down the powers of the Supreme Court and to cut down the powers of the IEBC in nullifying any election should those elections be held with the same mistakes and ignoring the Constitution and the law as the Supreme Court said. For example, in the new amendment proposed in Parliament before the elections, Uhuru and Ruto would like for the Electoral Commission to be chaired at any time by anybody other than the chairman, and any member of the commission to declare the results when they are made. Secondly, the Supreme Court powers to nullify the elections in the event that they are not held properly has been proposed to be curtailed by the new amendments in court. Our position is that you cannot change the rules of the game while the game is still on. The elections were nullified on the 8th of August to be held again on the 26th of August, but under the same rules under which they were nullified, not under rules now being set by the Supreme Court. What is the importance of Justice Maraga's decision to nullify this election in the context of the struggle for democracy in Africa? The appeal that NASA took to the Supreme Court over the August 27 presidential election was based on two major premises. One, that the presidential election was so badly conducted, administered, and managed by the IEBC that it failed to comply with the Constitution and other laws related to the election, and hence were not conducted in accordance with the Constitution and election laws. Two, that major malpractices of omission and commission by certain named agents of the Commission and other institutions of government amounted to a deliberate failure to deliver free, fair, and credible elections, and hence a subversion of the sovereign will of the Kenyan people. And finally, that the whole process of carrying out a democratic, free, and fair election is stipulated in the Constitution and clearly spelled out in laws governing elections in Kenya was ignored, violated, and deliberately fudged by the IEBC. Chapter 7 of the Constitution of Kenya is devoted to representation of the people and deals with this subject in three parts. Part 1 is on the electoral system and process. Please underline the word process. Without getting details of the other parts of this chapter of the Constitution, suffice it to say that it is this issue of not appreciating the importance of a free and fair election as a process whose different parts all matter in delivering a successful election that the defense attorneys failed to appreciate in formulating their defense. And after canvassing these issues in court by both the appellant and the defense attorneys, complete with the presentation of several affidavits before the court. 4 judges ruled that the election was carried out contrary to the constitutional provisions and election laws, and hence was a nullity. The defense attorneys were of the opposite opinion, that the victory was so overwhelming that the abrogation of laws and procedures amounted to minor human and technology errors that could not justify denying their candidate victory. Thus, to the defense, what was important was that votes were cast and they could be counted in the ballot boxes to determine who won. The appellant, on the other hand, was of the strong view that the process through which the votes finally arrived at the ballot box is vital in a democratic election, which is a process and not merely an event. This could be illustrated by a few examples. One, for example, the issue of stuffing ballot boxes with extra votes for Uhuru Kenyatta. Stuffing ballot boxes is a common practice in many African countries. And I'll give you one example. In one primary school called Naituyapaki Primary School in Olokurto Ward, this in Maasai country, Narok North constituency, the total number of registered votes was 507. The number of votes cast for Uhuru Kenyatta was 5,527. This showed an excess of 1,000% the number of people who turned out to vote. In Olerai Primary School in Ilmotiok Ward, Narok West constituency, the total number of registered votes was 624. The number of votes cast for Uhuru Kenyatta was 1,053. Close to 150% of voters turned out to vote, and they all voted for Uhuru Kenyatta. An examination of 15 polling stations in Narok County revealed a consistent pattern of more than 100% voter turnout, with the inflated number of voters favoring Uhuru Kenyatta. First of all, it's usually not very possible to have 100% voter turnout in any polling station, anywhere in the world, under free and fair elections, properly administered. There's also the example of electronically transmitting results without prescribed forms. An affidavit sworn by an IT expert, Godfrey Ososi, also one of NASA's tallying agents, showed that the IEBC was transmitting results to the National Tallying Center at the Bomas of Kenya without accompanying such results with the validly filled forms 34As for the presidential votes. Although the IEBC experts insisted that only stations lacking 3G and 4G network coverage electronically submitted results without the necessary accompaniment with the relevant forms, the list presented by Ososi to that effect showed that a number of stations whose forms could not be transmitted were in fact not in the said list. This demonstrated a deliberate cover-up by the IBC of the sins of commission. This was definitely not a legal basis for transmission of results without prescription forms. It was therefore further not possible to independently and accurately confirm that the prescribed forms that were manually transmitted to the National Tallying Center were in fact the forms that were filled by the presiding officers at the polling stations and the returning officers at the constituency and county tallying centers in the presence of agents of the political parties and the candidates as required by the law. Thirdly, the chasing away of agents and the filling of forms 34As and 34Bs fraudulently. Now, I don't want to bore you with this because this is a purely Kenyan example. But in general, what happens in most African countries, and it happened in the Kenyan election, that when you are a candidate in an election, you are expected to have your agents at the polling station to witness how polling is done, and also when the votes are being counted, to witness how the votes are counted and how forms are filled to reflect the votes that are cast for you. Now, when your agents are chased away from the polling stations and also from the counting centers, you jolly well know that both the presiding officer, the returning officers are very likely to fill forms that favor your agent, your opponent, and not yourself. And this is what happened in these examples. And I don't want to read the examples in detail because Forms 34As and 34Bs may not make any sense to you. But suffice it to say that they are filled in the absence of the agents of our party in those elections. The total valid votes in the original Form 34B was 38,269, while the downloaded Form 34B was 37,757, thereby creating a variance of 4,512 votes, which are not few votes when it comes to finally deciding who wins and who loses an election. Now, finally, in his ruling, Chief Justice David Maraga, reflecting the majority decision of the Supreme Court after having had the parties to the petition canvass before them, noted that a democratic election is a process and not an event. While the voting day is critical in this process, it is not a substitute for the process as a whole. And this is what is provided for in the Kenyan Constitution, and I have held the same position in several articles I've written on democratic election in Africa, including my own critique of both the 2013-2017 elections in Kenya. That is why John Kerry, your former Secretary of State, was absolutely wrong in his observation. Kerry said that when he was in Kenya, he saw people stand politely in long lines and vote, and he did not see any dead person vote. Quite stupid, isn't it? Because dead person cannot possibly be there to vote. But for Kerry, because lines were long and people voted, to him, that was a good enough example to give a clean bill of health, the Kenyan elections, as having been free and fair. Not realizing that what matters is after the voter has put his ballot in the ballot box, what happens after that is even more important. Because in Africa, you can vote and your votes may be counted. Your votes may be counted, but they may not be tallied to the tallying station to be put together. They may be transmitted to the tallying center, but they may not be counted in your favor. They may be counted in your favor, but they may not be announced by the returning officer or presiding officer in your favor. They may be announced, but the announcement may not be respected. And in final analysis, you find that somebody was announced that they have won, but in the law, when the list is published, your name is not there. In this case, for example, people voted, but when the system got finished at the end, as you can see, in a ballot box, there were strange ballot papers that are put there, which included yours that was there. But the number was inflated, which means that in the final analysis, your candidate did not receive fair justice. The 2010 Constitution is very elaborate on the issue of elections. Chapter 7 is devoted representation of the people and deals with this subject in 3 parts. I'll skip that. One would have thought that with such elaborate constitutional provisions as our Constitution gives, the 2013 and 2017 elections should have been held successfully, were the institutions in place to be represented and respected, and the rules of the game be followed by all players. What we have seen is that the institution could as well be in place, but they may not necessarily be used in line with their constitutionally prescribed functions, nor in accordance with the rules of the game meant to deliver free and fair elections. The IEBC has, in both 2013 and 2017, found itself embroiled in corruption charges for the manner in which it procures service providers and the manner in which its officials get involved in the politics of the ruling regime, thereby compromising its ability to manage the elections independently, efficiently, transparently, and accountably. The current Chief Executive Officer, Ezra Chiloba, and Isaac Hassan, who was chairman of the previous IBC, both exhibited at various times tendencies of partisanship to the Uhuru presidency. At the hearing of the court appeal against the results of the presidential election in 2013, Mr. Hassan, chairman of the IBC, who was expected to be a neutral referee, in defense of the IBC in that election, accused Raila Amolo Odinga, one of the candidates, as a perpetual loser fond of blaming others for his own failures, unquote. When you are a referee, you are not expected to take sides. You are expected to referee fairly and announce results without value judgment of any one candidate. But Hassan did take sides, which shows quite clearly that the IBC was not a neutral referee. This was quite unexpected of a referee meant to be neutral between the two players. Likewise, without necessarily coming out in public to express sentiments that paint Raila in bad light, the current chief executive officer of the IBC, Mr. Ezra Cheloba, has been less than polite regarding his attitude towards the opposition. Faced by pressure by the opposition for his resignation due to his management of the elections, Cheloba has been defiant and almost rude both to his chairman as well as to the opposition leaders. A report by the news magazine Kenya Today of September 26, 2017 is headlined, IBC's Cheloba mocks opposition NASA, confirms he and ICT head Muhati still in office, and chairman Chebukati memo was bullshit. With the chairman himself being regarded by his own officers, disregarded by his own officers, and his memo being called bullshit, there is real worry and concern that the Commission's independence might have been compromised by being controlled by agents of the state interested in using some of the officers of the Commission to once more undermine the process so as not to allow free and fair elections. The process begins, for example, with the registration and continues with voting and finally with the counting of votes, as I said. If this whole process is not done according to law and according to the Constitution, as if indeed those who are supposed to manage the process are themselves biased as to who they are serving, you're not likely to get free and fair elections in Africa, notwithstanding the establishment of institutions like Electoral Commission meant to manage elections in Africa democratically. So where do we go from here? The presidential election is now set to be held in Kenya on the 26th of October 2017. At the meeting held on Wednesday, 27th October or September, the other week, between the IBC, NASA, and Jubilee leadership, the two sides put their demands on what needs to be done regarding reforming the IBC and holding the elections. NASA's key demands are the removal of the IBC officials implicated in gross mismanagement of the elections and corruption, using a firm other than Al Ghurair of Dubai to print presidential ballot papers, inspection of IB servers and portal access to the cloud servers, establishing a bipartisan technical committee to oversee the implementation of the technology in use and appointing new returning officers in consultation with the political parties and candidates. In other words, NASA would like to see the Supreme Court reasons to nullify the elections respected by the IBC in the reforms and changes it makes in time for the October 26 elections. Failing to do that would mean that going to the elections is a futile exercise. And therefore, NASA has held the position that if the IBC is not reformed and changes made in the way it manages the election, NASA will not go to elections. The Jubilee, on the other hand, has made demands stating that no changes must be made at the IBC, that as much as possible, rather than rely on electoral transmission of votes, the manual system should be used, that the staff changes at the IBC demanded by NASA should be ignored. They made it mandatory for the Supreme Court to order ballot recount in the event of the presidential elections before the elections are held. And they have said that the ballot papers must be printed by the firm that printed them, and that was itself questioned by both NASA and the Supreme Court judges. So these conditions, as you can see, are poles apart. And whether they are going to be bridged before the election is something that I myself doubt. What is likely is that because of those disagreements, we are not likely to hold the elections on October 26th. What then follows? A constitutional crisis of major magnitude, which perhaps may need the intervention of the international community, but given the indifference of the international community to the Kenyan situation now, I think it's a situation that Kenyans themselves will have to face and see how it is resolved from within, and I just don't know how that will be done. In other words, because of the intransigence of the IEBC, disobeying the Supreme Court ruling, that crisis in Kenya will, for the first time, make us decide the extent to which institutions of governance established by the Constitution to govern election must be respected by all parties if indeed elections in Africa in general and in Kenya in particular are going to be free and fair in the advancement of democracy. Otherwise, what happened in Burundi, what is happening in Congo, what is happening in Uganda, may as well happen in Kenya, a country that people expected not to go backwards in terms of democratization, but to be an example for the rest of Africa in democratic governance. Unfortunately, where you have an authoritarian presidential regime, there's always that likelihood that you might go backwards in advancing democracy. And the US itself is not a better example. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Dr. Nyong'o has agreed to answer questions. Maybe we should take 2 or 3 at a time, and then we can answer them.
Yeah.
Okay. My question is, do you believe in democracy even at the risk of losing power? A true democracy means leaving the people to choose who they want, even if it is not you. Former Governor Ranguma recently filed a petition with the court to scrutinize and tally all the ballots and had very damning evidence against you in his petition. However, your responses were claims of corruption during his term and using of ODM colors to campaign. Isn't it weird that you didn't have anything to counter his evidence? Also, if you actually won fair and square, shouldn't you welcome a retaliating to prove your win? Why fight it unless you have something to hide?
Is there another question?
Yes, I'm wondering why Africans.
Can I have some paper to write those questions?
I'm wondering why
Just a piece of paper.
Keep on doing the same thing.
Just write on your own.
Because it could be party A or party B. Whoever wins, do the same. Doesn't matter. Raul Odinga may be trying to win if he was to be. So why do we keep on doing this so-called election? How come we don't come out with a system where we can maybe share power? Because if we should go to Kenya right now, you're going to realize it's tribal lines. Odinga's support is coming from his tribe. Uhuru's support is coming from his tribe. So I don't think Africa deserves, I don't know, to call it democracy but hopefully we can come out with a system where we share power instead of winner takes all.
Thank you. Another question or comment? Yes, ma'am.
My question for you today is, what do you think about China's presence across Africa, more specifically in Kenya? They have obviously implemented a lot of new roads and the train and a lot of things in the past year or two to advance the country. But do you think that their presence could become a threat to Kenyan citizens? And also, do you think their presence could spread to politics?
Thank you. You want to?
Let me take these 3, then I'll take the other one. Let me just deal with yours first. What do I think of China's presence in Africa? Well, China is welcomed in Africa. But doesn't mean that China always does good things in Africa. There are instances where China has succumbed to corrupt practices in undertaking major infrastructural projects in Africa. I'll give you an example. The standard gauge railway from Mombasa, which is supposed to go to Nairobi, through Malaba, through Uganda, to Eastern Congo. When I was in government as Minister for Planning 2003, 2005, that standard gauge railway plan as part of the flagship project for Vision 2030 in Kenya's development. When we were in the coalition government, we went to China and negotiated the implementation of that project with the Chinese. China Railways and Road Company was given the project, and financing was coming from China Exim Bank. We agreed on the cost of construction of that railway under the coalition government, which was something like, I would say, $237 billion or something. I can't quite remember. But what I know is that when Jubilee government came in, they broke the contract with China Rail and Road Company, renegotiated that contract at a higher cost, which was about 100 billion. I can't remember whether it's Kenya shillings or dollars, more than that. Denomination I quite remember, but it was higher than that, okay? Now there's been a raging debate in Kenya as to whether we can afford infrastructural development that increase our foreign debt. In fact, as I speak now, our public debt is 50% of our GDP, which is an unsustainable level of debt. So what we say is that, yes, we want investment. We want infrastructural investment, but not at any cost. We would not like our children's children to be burdened with debt in future. We'd like to do it at a cost we can afford, and without padding these projects with kickbacks and corruption. Okay. But it has been noted, really, that the Chinese companies tend to bend to this kind of arrangement. I'm not meaning that the Western companies don't do it. OT Mofo, the French company that is supplying what electrical equipment for this election, has also been known to be engaged in corruption. So was another British firm in the last election.
Okay, but is this public?
Yeah? You heard that? Is it what?
Is it public knowledge?
It's public knowledge, it's debated. For example, on the SGR, the debate is there. I mean, the economist David D has written extensively about it in the papers. So it's a public debate. It's not as if it's not known. It is a public debate. So all I'm saying is that, look, I myself, as a governor, would be ready to negotiate with the Chinese for infrastructural development, but I must make sure that it's a price we can afford and a quality that we agreed. Chinese construction roads in Kenya is commendable, by the way.
I was there this
You are there, yes. We agree. But we must always look at the matter of corruption and the cost at which we are building these things. It's very important that we do that due diligence. The Uhuru support, oh yeah, you are Christian. Since both Raila and Uhuru get support from their ethnic communities. Look, let me tell you something. We are not going to abolish ethnic communities in Africa. Nor is there anything wrong with communities taking place in politics and asserting their interest. The only thing that is wrong is when those interests are used undemocratically and in exclusion to the others' interests. Our constitution is very clear. But one of the things that is important in the constitution is that it recognizes two types of rights: people's rights and individual rights. People's rights include ethnic, racial, whatnot rights. Because my right to speak my language is my right, and cultural rights are enshrined in the Constitution. But that I have a right to speak my language is wrong when I use it to bar others from speaking their language. In other words, discrimination and politics of exclusion when it comes into ethnicity is what is wrong, not the fact that people organize themselves politically on ethnic lines. So that's why you find coalitions in Kenya are built around all kinds of ethnic groups coming together. But the Constitution says, and spells out very clearly, how that can be done democratically. Remember in Belgium, when they were faced with problem with the flames and the balloons, Lorenzo knows this very clearly. They then passed a law that when you are going to have representation in government, if a minister is a flame, permanent secretary must be a balloon. So that there is what you call a Belgian face in the constitution of the Belgian government. That's the same thing in our constitution now. I'm a governor of Kisumu County, but I'm expecting that at least 30% of the people who are hired in my county in the county public service be from outside the county, so that the Kenyan face is also seen in the county for purposes of national cohesion and integration. Now, easier said than done, because individuals will always find it easier to abrogate the law, just as we have seen the IBC officials doing. And therefore, there are institutions in the Constitution, like the National Integration and Cohesion Commission, which is expected to punish individuals and government officials who abrogate this principle in the Constitution. So it's one work in progress. I'm not saying that all those problems will be eliminated overnight, but it's something that we must build on, understanding that these ethnic communities must live together for purposes of building a modern Kenya. Now, my sister, about Ranguma. Look, Ranguma is quite free to go to court to challenge. I have never stopped him. But I have also put my case against him. The fact that he has gone to court and made certain allegations doesn't mean that the allegations are true. Those allegations must be canvassed in court by our lawyers. But fortunately, he has withdrawn the case while I was away, on very good grounds that the lawyer who swore the affidavit was not qualified to swear that affidavit because he's not registered as a lawyer under the Kenyan constitution, under the Kenyan laws. So that was just a mistake. But anybody, and that's why I'm telling you that the petitions that we have in Kenya, the highest number of petitions are against governors. We are 47 governors, 37 of us have petitions in the court challenging our elections for different reasons. But the point is that when somebody goes to court, then the case must be canvassed in a court of law. And you cannot take somebody's reason for going to court as being proof that he's right. Those reasons must be canvassed in court, and the judges must determine whether indeed it is me who committed travesty in the election or the IEBC. In the case of the NASA's case in the Supreme Court determined that neither Uhuru nor any Jubilee politician committed any sin. It was the IEBC which mismanaged the election. So the election was nullified because of sins of omission and commission by the IEBC. It may be true that in the case of elections in Kisumu County, it's again the IEBC who mismanaged the thing. And the sins of omission and commission was from the manager of the election, not from the candidates. Any other questions?
Let me ask, we have two.
Yeah.
Let me maybe get two people in the back, and then we'll come back.
Yeah.
I have one question, since it's made a lot of American news, or at least there was a lot of commenting on the quality of the international observers at the last election. Having been, as many of the faculty here may have been, an international observer, I thought I did a great job, but not. However, the weaknesses have, I think, been underestimated. So that's my question. And then the young man back here.
Yeah. Governor,
Yep.
I, for the longest time, noticed that most part of, big chunk of the power that African democracy is facing has also to deal with the West. Countries that former colonies, who some of them invest a lot in keeping in power people who deserve not to be there because they are not democratic elected. The first question is, for those fighting for democracy in Africa, what do you think would be the better approach for them to deal with the West, especially in international organizations like the UN? Which, personally, I don't believe in so much in those organizations because it's just like a group of people deciding the fate of a nation because they have their own interests. And the second level of the question, which is different, is I've seen a sort of pattern in the general level for most African nations struggling to have democracy. But when you look at countries that had France as a former colonies, they tend to have similar patterns. Take the case of Togo, you take the case of Ivory Coast, you take the case of Burkina Faso. All those things seem to follow the same pattern. Do you personally see that maybe through your research, that those countries who have France as their backup seems to have a more aligned pattern than other countries who might have other nations as their former colonies?
We're running out of time.
Very good question, actually.
So, do you, okay, real short. Okay.
Okay, good evening. My name is Kelly Page Gibrell. I'm a first-year PhD student here. Thank you for your talk. Very briefly, I was just curious what preparations were made for Chief Justice Maraga prior to nullifying the elections, and what kind of protection does he have now since he was so brave, and his family?
Okay. Real short. She's a good role model.
Very short, but he said everything I was about to, talk about because I'm sorry for my voice.
Yeah.
I'm from Côte d'Ivoire, and I was glad to mention Côte d'Ivoire. And the involvement of France is so paramount, so overwhelming. So my question was, I don't want to repeat what he had just, everything he said was so, quiet.
Oh, that's good.
Right. But the key question here is there any different, or how far the influence, if there's any, of Britain, the former colonial power of Kenya, how are they very much involved in Kenyan election as France, does for Côte d'Ivoire?
Well, thank you. I know, Dr. Winston, students have classes and things, so we don't want to hold you, but if you still have a quick...
So that's really, yeah.
Thank you.
It's a very quick question. What is your take on computer-generated leaders, specifically non-presidential elections in Kenya? I specify non-presidential elections in Kenya.
Thank you. So that
Okay. I see
they have class.
they have classes. Wish you all the best. Please pass your exams. I think these are very good questions, by the way. Let me answer them very quickly before you all disappear. International observers. I gave you the example of Kerry. That Kerry said that lions were quiet, people voted peacefully, no dead voters voted. That is perhaps the extreme level of what international observers can do, in that their observation is rather superficial. But the other example of international examples is the European observation team that did a much more thorough job and came out with 18 conditions for holding a free and fair elections, which were very reasonable after that election was nullified. So we cannot always condemn all international observers in a blanket form. There are some who do a very good job, like European observers, but in general, the majority of them tend to take the attitude that if the incumbent can be left to continue, it is better. They don't want to disturb the apple cart in most cases. Now, this is why the Kenyan thing presented the observers with a very kind of painful situation, because most of them had already said that the elections were in general free and fair. The word general is always there, that in the final analysis they would think that the election can be justified as having been held well and validly. But of course, they even urged Raila and us in NASA to accept the results and move on. Some of them even predicted the win before the announcements were made at the Bomas of Kenya. Yeah, these are public domain. Which means, therefore, that the observers in certain cases tend to be biased towards incumbents. In the case of Kenya, most Western governments support Uhuru because they think Uhuru government has provided a stable environment in the Eastern African region and has generally been useful in the struggle against terrorism and the struggle in Somalia, for that matter. So better the devil you know and the devil you don't know. That, I think, was informed the general attitude of the Western embassies. And it was very difficult for them to convince them before the Supreme Court decision that nothing was wrong with the election, because we met them several times and they're very intransigent in dismissing our case. Now, once the Supreme Court made that decision and pointed out in very detailed terms the constitutional provisions for holding a fair and fair election, which some of them were very ignorant of, then, of course, they said, look, sorry. And you saw the New York Times actually writing an editorial retracting the position they have held earlier and apologizing to Raila. And I think it was very important that this has happened this way, because finally I think the intellectual laziness of Western observers and ambassadors have been shown. Let me tell you something. I myself am not very impressed by the level of intellectual sophistication of the ambassadors from the Western world we have in Nairobi today, as compared with men like Michael Muselberg, the German ambassador who was there before, or Ambassador Elizabeth from France, and so on, or Mark Bellamy from here, or Johnny Castle, who was there before. The current lot of ambassadors we have in Nairobi fall below the par of intellectual sophistication, of understanding African affairs. I must say that. And I think that their pronouncement, the analysis of Kenyan politics is quite clear that the West should improve the level of representation in Africa to make us have a reasonable discourse with them. I think the issue of democracies in Africa and how we deal with the West regarding, for example, French behavior in Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, and Burkina Faso, I think it's made us say the same thing I say about Kenya. Sometimes when the Western government take a position in a local situation in Africa, they tend to be dogmatic about it until things go out of hand. You saw it in Cote d'Ivoire. It took long for the French socialists to understand that Gbagbo was going the wrong direction. I mean, I'm a friend of Gbagbo. I knew it when I was doing research in Cote d'Ivoire, in Simone and all that. And obviously I really supported when the Front Populaire stood for the election the first time and so on. But as Gbagbo kept on postponing elections and trying to stay in power without any kind of popular legitimacy, he became an embarrassment to progressive forces in Africa. And no wonder, as I said, that when a president does that, you invite opposition from two sides, from within the state by the military, which is what happened in Cote d'Ivoire, and from outside the state by social groups and sometimes militias. Those are external forces that can challenge a regime. It depends on the situation. The militias can be extremely right-wing, as we have seen in Angola and then in Cote d'Ivoire. So militias are not equivalent to liberation movement. They can be very destructive. But it is because the regime itself did not allow room for democratic participation and resolution of conflict that militias arise. Militias don't come from heaven. They come from actual positions in Africa. And the regimes that nurture militias must be held responsible for the coming to being of militias. And that was the case of Cote d'Ivoire. Now, look, I think what we need to do is very important. Just we do the concrete analysis of the various situations in various African countries, and just like we are doing in the case of Kenya, and hold very principled position regard to democratic struggle. Now, what preparations are made to protect Justice Maraga? Now, the Kenyan situation is very interesting, but just the other day, the government decided out of the blue to remove security for Raila, who was a former prime minister, and Kalonzo, who is a former vice president. The Constitution says that these people must be given protection when they leave office, because the same Constitution, Article 226, says that you are responsible for actions you took in government, whether in government or outside government, Article 226. And therefore, when you are prime minister and a vice president, it means there's certain government secrets, certain information you still have, that if you are arbitrarily killed by some thug, the state will lose. So your protection is extremely important. It's much more so for a Chief Justice who is in office. It is incumbent upon the government to give such a Chief Justice maximum protection. And that is why Maraga said that if anything happens to any of us, the Kenyan government will be responsible, because it is duty-bound to give these people protection. It is not a privilege. So we hope that is very clear to those who provide security. Now, is there any difference between British approach in Kenya and France in Cote d'Ivoire? In a sense, the behavior both Britain and France towards their former colonies very much the same. They still regard them as foster children, who must always be looked after, whether you like it or not. That is the attitude. The only thing, as a British former settler said in Kenya when independence came, he said, well, we have given them the government, but we shall keep the banks. He said it at the airport. It was written as East African Standard then. Since these people have kept the banks, you must understand that they're still interested in the economies of this country because of investments and interest, and also strategic interest. So it's a reality we have to deal with. And the reality we have to know how to deal with on a daily basis. We can't run away from them. Computer-generated leaders. Vifaranga vya computer. You speak Swahili? Unaongea Kiswahili. Sasa hawa vifaranga vya computer wana. You know, it happened, cybercrime and cyber things. Once you have the age of electronic voting, electronic counting of votes, relaying of results electronically and so on, you must also accept that there would be cybercrime, i.e. the hacking of votes. What happened in the case of Kenya was very interesting. I can reveal to you that essentially what happened was that the Form 34As were supposed to be relayed from constituency tallying stations and polling stations electronically to the tallying center at the Bomas of Kenya, the national one. That is in the election laws. But apparently when they were being released, they were going through another server, not necessarily the server of the IEBC. So when the Supreme Court Chief Justice ordered the IEBC to open up their server for scrutiny by NASA on a read-only basis, the IEBC declined. That their lawyer said in court was that the servers were in France. And at that point in time, the French were asleep. So they could not open the servers. This is in record. So the IEBC said, sorry, you can't have access to the servers. So of course, the Chief Justice said, we are not fools. We know exactly what we are talking about. From our own inquiry, we came to realize that actually the information was being diverted to another server, not necessarily the IBC server. So one of the reasons why the IBC declined for their servers to be liquidated, well, there's nothing in there. Otherwise, why refuse? So this is one of the ways by which vifaranga via computer can be generated, and computer-generated leaders. I mean, it so happens, apparently, that is much easier unless there's integrity in the management election. That's why I was saying we can have these institutions, but unless we have individuals who are committed to use this institution transparently, accountably, simply, and honestly, those same institutions, whether electronic or manual, can be used to subvert a democratic election. Now, it's very telling that when Chris Musando, who was a man in charge of this electronic process in our IBC, was murdered, assassinated, and his hand also chopped off.
That was your cousin, right?
Yeah, he was tortured, and his hand was chopped off. Apparently, these people, he had refused to give him his password, and we think that the hand was chopped off so that his fingers could be used to go and have access. Now, this is the thing. Now, what is interesting, the Western embassy, the Western envoys, never condemned the murder of Musando. They said that is part and parcel of electoral violence in Kenya. And we were shocked. In other words, they were going out of the way to protect the Uhuru government from that murder of Musando. The government itself has not up to date pronounced itself on that matter to this very day. I happen to know Musando very well, a man with high integrity, at the IBC. He's married to my wife's first cousin. You see. And he had said that morning on an interview with KTN that he was assuring all parties to go and campaign. He will make sure that the system of processing the votes electronically is done with integrity. He made a statement in the KTN in the morning of that day, Friday, and again at 5 o'clock, to be murdered that night. That is the extent to which he was committed to seeing fair and fair election. Now, if indeed you can then kill the person who has pronounced himself with integrity to do that, and then at the same time Buhati, somebody called Buhati, who had been suspended because of dishonesty, was that same day brought back to play the role that Msando was playing, very cynically. So those are the things that happened. Thank you, Lorenzo.
Thank you.
Last question.
Very philosophical question.
Yeah.
How do you manage being the father of a very famous international athlete? Very philosophical.
Oh yeah, Lupita.
I manage.
Let me tell you. He did some theater. You didn't tell her that.
Who, me?
Yeah, did you do some theater?
That's my sister there. She can tell you what I did.
Inherited it then, right?
Yes, Aching.
Yeah.
Tell them.
How you manage?
Yeah.
You can tell them. God.
Well, I mean, it's a question that I'm always shy to answer, you know, because human beings grow up to be adults and to do what they do in the context of their time. But as a parent, we remain parent. We keep on parenting our kids, whether they are actors or actresses or whatever. So for us, she's still a child who must be looked after.
Certainly, and you've done a good job.
Yeah.
So thank you, and I think